Welcome everybody. It's really with a great pleasure receiving you all for this WASH debate. We will get started now. Some people will still be coming in as we go on. But it's really good to already have you all on board. We're well over 70 people at the moment, and we'll see how many more will be coming. It follows a long list of debates that we've had the pleasure of organizing as IRC. We've done it in person over the years, and this is the first virtual version that we have. And in these challenging and difficult times, I really hope that everybody is safe and that your families and your loved ones are in good health. Over the next 1.5 hours, we will be bringing a lot of interesting discussions and thoughts and debates. And we hope that this will widen your perspective and increase your thinking about water, sanitation and hygiene, and the role and the link between them with climate adaptation. But before we dive into those parts, I'm just taking you through the webinar or the debate points, which you can see on the slide. First of all, familiarize yourself with Teams. I know many of you are using virtual tools these days, might be slightly different. Know that there's a conversation window or a chat window, and please do put in their questions or links that you might have or comments. We request everybody's video to be off unless you are speaking. So at the moment, it should be just my video on at the moment. And please do mute yourself to avoid confusion. You will also see there's the possibility of raising your hand, which we'll be using during the debate session of these 1.5 hours. Please also note that you have to lower it once you have been able to speak. We are looking to use a bit of participation, and we're using a voting tool for that, which is called Mentimeter. So as you can see, there is a request if you can register at menti.com. Just go to that website and it will ask you for a code. The code is 47244, and we'll be using it as the debate continues. Just that you're all aware, we are making a recording of this session and that will be shared later. And will be made available. So what are we really going to be doing today? You know, the WASH debates have been going on since 2014, and the focus of it has always been to bring WASH professionals and related colleagues all together to discuss wicked topics of the WASH sector. Traditionally, we've done it in the political capital of the Netherlands, which is The Hague, and there's always a focus around the Netherlands water policies, particularly the 50-30 WASH strategy, which is about providing 50 million people with first-time access to sanitation and 30 million people for first-time access to drinking water. And that's not easy, and that's why there are always some wicked topics to discuss. And we've been discussing things like leaving no one behind, social inclusion in the WASH sector, sustainable WASH services in fragile states. How far can you get? But for today, we will be discussing something much more, well, interesting or hot, and that is around climate change and the WASH sector. And I'm just going to request Evita to start moving the slides as we go, to go to the objectives of today. So the idea is that we'll have the opportunity to get to strengthen our common understanding about why adaptation is so needed for the WASH sector and how that relates to all the other threats that we have in the sector. The second is to give ideas how to sharpen our approaches and activities that we have as a WASH sector. And third is also to indicate opportunities that climate change and climate change adaptation actually brings and collaborate with the climate change sector. And for that, we'll be using a wonderful panel. And Evita, please go to the next slide, which is, first of all, is Majuri, who will be presenting something around India. She is the 2019 Ton Schouten Award winner, and she'll be bringing us climate change reality from India. This will be followed by processes and activities and situations that are in Ethiopia by our IRC country director, Lemessa Mekonta from Ethiopia. And after that, we have the pleasure of hosting Maaike van Ginneken, the CEO of SNV, who will be talking about the climate financing and the relation to WASH and how that could be working. We're also very pleased to be able to welcome Marcel Bokerboom, who is the Netherlands Climate Envoy and who will be the discussant towards the end of the various sessions. We have ample space for discussion, questions and answers. The last half an hour will be all around that, but during any time, feel free to put in questions in the chat box or to engage in that way during the debate section towards the end. So following those introductions, I want to introduce myself. I'm Arjen Naafs. I'm working with IRC WASH. I'm working on climate change and water resources, and I have the joy of being your moderator for today. Which brings me actually to you. Who are you and where are you? So let's get active. We would like to ask you to go to menti.com and type in the code 47244. The idea of this is that there is a way of engaging with a wider group of people because we don't have the advantage of all being together in the room. So we have been looking for different ways of engaging and getting ideas and thoughts from the room and not just via the chat. So if all is correct, you should be now on menti.com and you should have a question, what type of organization would you say you represent? So feel free to fill that in and then we will be seeing the results coming up. So I know what I am, but I have no idea from which organizations are you. So please do fill it in. And don't forget to press submit at the bottom, otherwise it will not be sent to the group.
Can you remind us of the code, please, Arjen?
Yes, of course. That is 47244. 47244. And the interesting thing is there's a German word which is called the Vorführeffekt, or some in the English version would be the demo. Whenever you want to give a demonstration of something, it won't be working as desired. We're supposed to be seeing the results popping up. Evita, maybe you could do a quick refresh of the screen, and otherwise we'll continue with the next question. Yeah, there we go. Wonderful, thank you very much. So we can see quite a focus on the international NGO component, but I'm really happy to see government, private sector, NGOs, and some researchers as well. Always the fascinating bit, who are the others? Okay, and please go to the next question. And don't worry, we will be having space and time for this. Can you please type in, indicate which country you're from, and Kenya gets the prize for being the fastest. There are lots of countries popping up. You can see France, the Netherlands, Spain, Ethiopia, United States. It really is a very nice mix. And this for us is a joy because traditionally, as I said, the WASH debates have been in the Netherlands and we necessarily had to limit it for the group in the Netherlands, which was interesting, but now we're happy to be able to engage more people around the globe. Wide group of people, thank you very much. And now to make it a little bit more interesting, Evita, can you go to the next question? So what we're going to be doing is throughout the 1.5 hours, we'll be having a little quiz, which will have a prize. So for that, please put in a name in the Mentimeter. This can be a fun name. This can be your real name. This can be the name that's allocated to you. And then we'll be starting with some questions about this. And I'm really pleased somebody is really liking this idea because the hearts are just flying in. Thank you very much. So we've got lots of people already joining. It's a whole crowd of people, and let's get started with the quiz. So you will have a question and you get judged by answering it correctly and by the speed by which you answer. If you have it wrong, you'll get 0 points. So Over to Evita, can start the quiz. Please go to the next one. Yeah, go to the next one. There was a hitch, which is always when you want to give an example. Don't worry, it will be working soon. Please go one more, Evita. Okay, thank you. We will come back to the quiz. We'll solve the slight glitch in the background. I'm very sorry about this. But in the meantime, allow me to take you through some very interesting components. One of it is the whole discussion about the balance between do we need to adapt and how do we adapt versus we have so many other threats in our sector. And I always like stories. So when we are preparing this, we've been looking for stories around the globe. And we were reaching out to somebody in Burkina Faso, and he said, great, fantastic climate adaptation. But at the moment, there's a lot of insecurity going on. We have a semi-war going on, and we basically don't have space and time to address anything to climate change. It's an indication that there are other threats to supplying wash services. Another example is a utility manager in South America who already is struggling with 40% non-revenue water. And he's struggling to pay the power bill for the next month. And he was indicating, how can I prepare for climate change? What can I do? I don't have any funds for it. A third example is from a water system designer visiting a utility in Africa, where actually there's willingness and an ability to do something. But they already have a 30% surge capacity, meaning the pipes are already made for peak hours. How much more buffer is needed to be adaptable to climate change? Another 10%, another 20%, or another 100%? And that is one of the challenges that we have. What is the additionality that we have in the sector? What is the additionality that we can allocate to climate change? How can we justify working on it? Next slide, please. Because it's easy to talk about it, but the reality is this. There are many people around the world struggling to have safe access to water, sanitation, and hygiene. And it's a question of survival, dignity, and justice. And climate change really already has a devastating impact. This is a picture from Bangladesh, and it affects the people that have least caused climate change. So there is a component of improving that situation. Extreme weather is becoming more frequent, and these trends are predicted to rise as climate change continues to change. And this will undermine the balance that we already have for the millions of people, sustaining what we have already achieved. Next slide, please, Evita. And there is an opportunity. The world is changing. There is a whole amount of new tools coming out from global data informations, climate financing is coming, technological innovation is there. There's what we could call the Greta effect that at least the Western world is mobilizing to do. There's a lot of system thinking, which ISC is of course very familiar with. But then there are the challenges of urbanization that is increasing and consumption rates that are increasing. It's always a balance to it. What can we do? So recognizing that the wash sector in itself is also a polluter and using quite a lot of energy, basically for the water treatment and the transport and for the wastewater treatment, but also sanitation in itself pollutes greenhouse gases. So there's a mitigation component. But today we're talking about adaptation, climate-proof resilient structures, risk-based water resource management, prioritizing groundwater because it's more climate resilient for drinking water, making buffer zones and infiltration zones. Because the key of it all is where institutions, households and individuals have good wash services, they will be more resilient and are more likely to be able to cope with other changes and challenges as we have now with the COVID, for example. And The adaptation is changing as well because of the financing mechanisms that are supporting it. And with this, I would like to reach out to my jury. We have decided to take it as a recording because of the internet issues that might be there. This gives a very good advantage. She is online, so she'll be able to see the chats and all the questions you ask during the presentation. My jury is a 2019 Ton Schouten Award winner for storytelling, and she's also a climate reality leader. She is finishing training as the fellow of the Swedish Institute, Leader Lab for Gender Equality Advocates, and she is working a lot around menstrual hygiene and gender issues and climate change. Over to you, Evita, to start the presentation.
Hello, my name is Mayuri Bhattacharjee. I'm a 2019 Don Schouten Award winner and a climate reality leader trained in 2018. This presentation is really close to my heart due to a couple of things that I experienced a few weeks back. Which brings me to this image, my red water bottle. It is now a constant reminder that climate adaptation in the wash sector is a necessity, and here's why. On May 20th, 2020, it was another day in quarantine for most of the world. But super cyclone Amphan, it hit my state, West Bengal, and my city, Kolkata. For nearly 3 days, we were without electricity, running water supply, and mobile connectivity. Water flooded the ground floor of our house and submerged our water reservoir. And this is a photo of my left of my ground floor. When I looked at this photo later, I realized truly, climate crisis has entered my house. Soon after, I was dealing with a personal water crisis post-cyclone. We were rationing a few things which we were never rationing before. When it came to drinking water, we rationed 550 ml of drinking water per person in a 24-hour period. When it came to sanitation and hygiene, we rationed 2.5 washroom trips in a 24-hour period for seniors in the house and 2 trips for me. And I was so glad I wasn't menstruating. For 56 hours, I felt I was living someone else's life, and I wanted the nightmare to end. I'm privileged, so my nightmare ended faster, but that's not the case for them. Even after 16 days, this village in South 24 Parganas in West Bengal was submerged underwater. And similar or more terrifying nightmares are being predicted by science about my city and the world. According to the Coastal Risk Screening Tool by Climate Central, large parts of my city, Kolkata, will be submerged by the time I'm 60. So will wash systems be at risk? Definitely. But let's hold on more to that and now look into our oceans. This is a graph showing the number of ocean heat wave days which are increasing ever since 1900. So what does it mean for my city, Kolkata? Indian Ocean is the warmest among all the oceans. The Northern Indian Ocean, which comprises the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, on which Kolkata is located, generate about 7% of the world's cyclones. This year, both Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal were about 1 degree warmer than normal in early May, and hence the conditions were conducive to increasing the strength of the cyclones. And this was a quote by Jayaraman Srinivasan, a scientist at the Indian Institute of Science. And below, you can see a satellite image showing a temperature anomalies in North Indian Ocean on May 19, a day before Cyclone Amphan made landfall. And there was a variation of more than 2 degrees in the Bay of Bengal on that day. So is it just about one ocean? Let's go back to 2017 to other part of the world. The United States. Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey crossed waters in the Gulf of Mexico that were up to 4 degrees hotter than normal. What it meant was generally hurricanes, when they approach land, they're supposed to decrease in intensity. But due to the warmer air and warmer waters, the hurricane only intensified and it wreaked devastation more than it would have wreaked in the past. So all these indicate one thing. This flooding, hurricanes, cyclones, and also droughts. It means one thing. Climate adaptation in the wash sector ceased to be a distraction a long time back. It's a necessity. And this is a meme I found on the internet, which I think captures this entire crisis more than what my words would capture right now. But let's shift gears a bit. Let me tell you a story from my region, a much more hopeful story. Well, we know about the adverse impact of the climate crisis on WASH and how it affects women disproportionately, but this is not that story. I came across this group of women in the Sundarban region, Delta region, and I call them the Climate Action Ninjas. This group of 50 women organized to fight against climate change in Sundarbans by forming a mangrove action committee. This group later on stepped up efforts to work on sustainable menstruation after realizing the harmful effects of disposable pads in their region. And now that cyclone Amphan hit them, they are also showing leadership in relief efforts. Thus, they showed leadership within their means in their local community. Now, this leads me to think, can we rethink women's role to achieve climate adaptation in the wash sector? For this, I must really applaud IRC Washes. She Makes Change campaign in Orissa. The goal to train women to ensure they have the knowledge, confidence, and skills to advocate for the right to wash services and to participate in local government decision making. But I want to give another twist to it, and I want to step it up. From a gender and climate rights lens, I see potential in such organizing. I see this woman to step up to advocate for resilient wash services as their region Orissa is vulnerable to extreme weather events. But I also understand that the road to climate adaptation is full of challenges and it's not so easy. Some of the challenges could be lack of political will and political stability, cost implications from WASH programs, and user behavior change, to name a few. But the ongoing COVID-19 crisis has brought focus onto the WASH sector, and the importance of hand washing, access to water, and hygiene is being highlighted in popular discourse like never before. I think you must have seen, let me share my screen inside. I think you must have seen the number of hand washing challenge videos, and I have also done those on TikTok, on my recently opened TikTok channel. That was something I did during this quarantine. But all these developments, they make me really hopeful. I really believe this is our moment. I believe so more because for 56 hours, I felt helpless. I wasn't prepared as a citizen. My city wasn't prepared, and definitely our wash systems weren't prepared. So therefore, as a wash professional working in this area, I feel a personal responsibility after facing a crisis of my own. And this brings me to my favorite definition of leadership. Leadership is accepting responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. And when it comes to uncertainty, these are the perfect times. Thus, I leave you with two questions. One, with the renewed focus on WASH due to the pandemic, how might we envision our sector's future to provide leadership for tackling the climate crisis? Second question. What kind of partnerships should WASH actors enter or facilitate to unleash the leadership of people to tackle the climate crisis? And this is where I leave you. I'm looking forward to the rest of the debate. Thank you so much. This is my Twitter handle, Mayuri Tejpur. Tejpur is my hometown where I was born in Assam. And I'm also running a campaign for women-friendly flood shelters in Assam. You can look at that in this video. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For me.
Thank you very much, Mayuri, and we also have you online. Apologies for some of the sound. Not everybody has been able to hear it with full clarity, but I hope you have been able to follow it. Hi, Mayuri. Thank you for also being online. Would you like to say some words about reflections about the presentation?
Like I said before, this was really personal because of the cyclone which hit my city and what I felt. I mean, it's quite a different thing that as a wash professional, when you see others suffering or you go into humanitarian situations to do relief. But when it happens right in your house, that's definitely a different experience. And I have been passionate about climate change and mitigation, adaptation. But after the experience, I really felt that I have a personal responsibility to do something. So this is why this is a really, topic close to my heart.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody who has a clarification question for Majuri before we continue? Please raise your hand if you do have one. Personally, I found one of the things that you mentioned, that it's really hitting home, so to say, but even then you're still not prepared. Your city wasn't prepared, yourself weren't prepared, even though you're a person working with WASH, you know about the situation, but it still came as a surprise. And I think that's something that we're all finding ourselves when it actually hits. We have the scientists talking about it, but eventually it still takes us by surprise. There's a correlation there with what's happening with the COVID pandemic, of course, as well. Okay. I would like to continue also in the interest of time. If you have any questions, please bear them in mind or put them in the chat. The second presentation focuses more on ways how a country is able to work with climate change and how to adapt and plan for it. And we have the pleasure of having Lemessa Makonta, who is the country director for IRC Ethiopia. It's a vast experience over well over 20 years in hydrogeology as well. And he's been working with IRC as an associate since 2013. In a similar way, we have got a recording, but I assume the sound should be better now. Feel free to put questions in the chat box, and afterwards we will reach out to Lemessa. Back over to you, Evita, to kickstart the presentation.
To start with my talk, firstly, I will begin with the country context in line with climate change, then moving to sector-specific strategies for adaptation for this climate, and finally conclude my talk with a kind of probing how climate change adaptation in WASH could be a distraction. Ethiopia is prone to extreme climate variability, both spatially and temporally. The country is actually arid to semi-arid for more than 65%. Such climate variability has caused climate-related hazards, such as floods and droughts. For example, if we have looked at since 1980s, the country has experienced multiple drought that has caused dozens of life loss. And similarly, there have been a number of floods since 1988, causing more or less similar causalities. Now, the big question is whether such climate-related hazards are really due to climate change or due to poor water management or due to the conventional existing climate harsh. There has been some analysis on the past trend of climate as well as on the future projection. For example, meteorological data analysis for over 15 years in the country has shown a temperature rise of only 0.37 degrees Celsius. Again, for rainfall, this is more or less similar. But a projection over 3 periods, which is from 2030, 2050, and 2080, shows a rise in temperature ranging from 0.9 degrees Celsius up to 3.4 degrees Celsius. So we are expecting, like, after 60 years from now, a temperature rise of 3.4 degrees Celsius. The same analysis has shown, like, more or less similar precipitation. There has been a study that shows the relationship between temperature rise and water availability, as well as temperature rise and the incidence of diarrheal disease. In East Africa, for example, a temperature rise by 4 degrees Celsius would cause a reduction of water availability by 50%, whereas a temperature rise by 1 degree Celsius would lead to an incidence of diarrheal disease by 5%. When we come to adaptation strategy in the country has developed and endorsed a climate adaptation strategy, which is called a climate resilient green economy. This is a governing strategy which a country has. And this strategy insists for all development programs to mainstream climate adaptation in their plan. This strategy is cascaded through national adaptation plan. And the recent adaptation plan is the one developed last year during 2019, developed for the coming 15 years. For example, this adaptation plan shows the country requires $6 billion USD per year to mainstream all climate adaptation plan in its development program. If we have look at a sector-specific adaptation strategy, which is WASH, particularly in this case is water supply focused. There are 3 main strategies identified in relation with water supply. One is on enhancing water quantity and ensuring water quality. And the second one is on technology choices, mainly using low energy demanding technologies and renewable energy sources. And the third one is about using multi-village community water supply systems. In line with enhancing water quantity and water quality, groundwater is the major focus area because it is one of the resilient water supply sources and also currently the main water supply sources for the country. As part of this, there is a massive campaign in soil and water conservation, as well as in a national campaign on afforestation. For this year alone, for example, 5 billion trees are planned to be planted. In terms of technology, again, the main strategy is to reduce carbon emission through using renewable energy for water pumping as well as for water treatment. Multi-village water supply schemes are actually deep borehole or motorized deep boreholes that could serve multiple villages and sometimes even multiple districts. So now the question is, can we really ensure the sustainability of water supply services only by considering or by ensuring water sources or water quality? Of course, the answer is no, because there has to be a number of other factors to be considered to ensure water supply sustainability. And some of them are like ensuring the design, the construction, post-construction management, including operation and maintenance, because all these have their big stake in sustaining water supply services. Again, if we have looked at the key challenges of WASH in the country, there are really a number of challenges for that. One is the existing limited access, low service levels, unreliable services because services of WASH are frequently interrupted, and also a big question for sustainability. So climate change actually only aggravates all those existing problems. So solving or overcoming the existing WASH challenges would definitely lead to further progress toward this adaptation and resilience of climate change. Climate change adaptation could be a distraction in WASH. Actually, one is if we fail to address non-climatic challenges due to focus on climatic factors. And the second one is if adaptation is mainstreamed in WASH without reliable data, because planning is really planning for adaptation, and resilience should rely on reliable data. And the third one is if the adaptation is not followed by a clear guideline and the priorities, this would definitely lead to the distraction in WASH. And the fourth one is if the climate change or lack of mainstreaming adaptation is seen as an excuse for every failure in WASH services. And the fifth one is if climate change adaptation is perceived as a sole solution for WASH challenges instead of being only as a one factor. And the final one is if adaptation is perceived as a prerequisite to finance WASH rather than as one aspect is to sustain WASH services. Thank you so much. Back to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Demessa, for setting that up. It's fascinating to hear, particularly on that last slide, a couple of the points that were being raised. And a couple of things already in the chat that are coming up. For instance, that it's always to be very contextualized, being remarked by Peter Burry. And there's a question about bulk water transfer. Messa, I think you're online. Could I just ask you to briefly come on screen and give some reflections on that? And in the meantime, Evita, can you set up again Mentimeter? We'll try it one more time.
Okay, good. Thank you, Arian. Unfortunately, I couldn't see any message in my chat box. It could be, a problem of
the
so application. Yeah, maybe if you can just summarize if there are some questions in the chat box.
Okay. There is a question about, is there any bulk water transfer from major rivers being done to reduce the dependency on groundwater sources? Is anything like that happening in Ethiopia?
Yes, not actually in arid parts of the country, but in the Rift Valley, there is an experience of bulk transfer of water through long pipe system from highland to the Rift Valley. It is not due to climate change, but related to water quality, which is contamination of fluoride.
Great. And one other one, which is related to the challenge of climate change and rural communities. What are the strategies earmarked to minimize the effects for the most vulnerable population? You briefly mentioned some of the policies that are in place. Can you use a few minutes?
Especially in an arid region is the use of indigenous knowledge, for example, in southern part of Ethiopia, in Borana, and also in southeastern part of the country, in Somali, how to enhance and also how to strengthen indigenous knowledge of communities in climate adaptation, like through storing water for a longer time. This is more of about enhancing indigenous knowledge and how communities have survived before.
Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. And with all things, one has to keep trying. And we're going to try one more time Mentimeter. So please grab your phone or your browser and indicate how are you feeling at the moment. We've had 2 presentations with a lot of information already. Is there some energy in the room? And if not, we'll think of ways to reactivize. And it looks like we're all still quite energetic, great and fantastic. So then I would say we continue, and if all goes well, inshallah, we'll be able to continue the quiz that was initiated. Over to you. Yeah, great. So you will have a short time to answer the questions that are coming up, and speed and of course accuracy is important. So go ahead, Evita, and ask the first question that is there. Start quiz, it's the little button, bottom. And it looks like it's working. So did you pay attention? How many milliliters of drinking water did Missouri have during the cyclone? Did you look on your phone, not at the screen? How much did she have? How many people will be answering that? Let's see. And we have 22 people that give the right answer. That's of course not about the amount that's very important. It is about the fact that it's too little to officially live on. You normally need 3 liters of drinking water in hot climates, 25 liters of water for general domestic purposes. So the moment a situation comes like a cyclone, everybody is struggling. And we heard the story of Marjorie, how she's been coping and how she considers herself fortunate to be able that it was only a limited number of days. It shows the preciousness of water and drinking water. Pay attention because we will be giving prizes at the end. So let's see who's been paying attention to the next one. Please, over to you, Evita, for the next one. And let's see. We've got Cool being quite up ahead. Okay. Quite a lot of people there. Okay, next question. How many major droughts since the early 1980s were in Ethiopia? And see if you remember how many there were. It's not just knowing exactly how many droughts there were. The point is we need information to be able to plan. We need evidence, and also what happened in the past may be changing in the future because of climate change, but it's an indication. The correct one was 7. Obviously, you can argue a lot when is it a drought, but it does show that there are numerous times that is a very big risk to the population as a whole in Ethiopia. And with climate change coming up, it looks to be even worse in the future. Even though rainfall might be similar, it might be more extreme. Okay, and I think we have Kelly at the moment in the lead, it looks like. Great, she is definitely the fastest till date. Okay. With that, there was a little energizer, so to say. I would like to welcome you all to the next speaker, Meike van Ginneken, who is the CEO from SNV, but also very much a sector colleague in the wash sector and in the water sector. And she has very broad experience in agriculture, water, energy, and also in financing. Meike, can I ask you to take the floor and to use your video so we can see you?
Yeah, thanks, Arjan, and great to see a lot of old acquaintances and new friends on the list of participants. It's always weird to present through Zoom, but I hope to see you in person soon. What I wanted to talk about today is about climate change, WASH, and financing. I want to start with saying why climate finance for WASH is hard. So that's the pessimistic part. But then I want to give a few tips from experience on what we can do to really attract climate finance into improving WASH services. Why is this hard? Let me start there and depress all of you a little bit. Climate mitigation is a global public good. We all need to act. for the benefit of all. But that makes it hard to finance because who's going to pay for it? Water, sanitation and hygiene services and climate adaptation brings private benefits to household, but also has large public externalities. So WASH and climate adaptation are semi-public goods, individual public goods, also hard to finance. So it doesn't come as a surprise that it's hard to finance climate resilient WASH services because there's so many externalities. And because it's hard to recover costs from users and thus create sufficient cash flows to attract investors. This is nothing new for all of you. No, we've all been talking about attracting reimbursable or commercial financing to WASH for decades. And despite much effort we've all put into this, the sector remains highly dependent on public grants and as a result is chronically underfunded. Part of this picture is that cost recovery is still low. Some of you might have seen the OECD review of levels of cost recovery and sources of financing for WASH services in EU states, in European countries. And even there you see a very high dependency on public finance. I think for the Netherlands, it was actually 60% of WASH investments come from public sources. Many in the WASH sectors, I certainly was one of them, hoped that climate financing can fill this finance gap. The expectations for climate finance are very high. And a few years ago, the world's wealthiest countries collectively pledged $100 billion annually to support climate actions. $100 billion sounds like a very, very big number, but it's actually not such a big number because it's across all the sectors, across all the countries. And just to give a benchmark, globally, the amount of subsidies to fossil fuel subsidies is actually nearly $400 billion. So it's the pledge of the rich countries is actually only a quarter of what fossil fuel subsidies are. And even that commitment is not fully met. We also need to realize that most available climate financing is not in grant form. It's actually reimbursable. And that can range from very soft credits, interest-free, to pretty commercial terms loans. So while there's some climate finance in the form of grants, this is very limited and we need to think how can we attract reimbursable financing to the WASH sector. Now, that was the depressing part. Let me say why I think despite this being quite difficult, it's still worthwhile for WASH to look to climate finance and to think what are the things we really need to do? What are specific practical ways of doing this? My first tip to all of you, my first recommendation is that as WASH professionals, we need to learn how private or commercial financing works and how climate financing works. My experience is that as a WASH professional, we're all passionate about our projects. We believe in our projects and we believe in the imperative of universal access for all to water and sanitation services and the SDGs. We often overestimate how financeable our projects are. And when I've seen WASH professionals, including myself, interacting with investors, we often are in advocacy modus. We often say, oh, but it's really important and you need to do this, or lobbying. But lobbying doesn't work. You need to shift to a more fact-based approach. We all need to learn a new language, the language of finance. And we need data. We need a lot of financial data. Building trustful relationship with investors is anchored in presenting a full picture of the project you're trying to get financed, a quantitative picture of the project you're trying to get financed, and a brutally honest picture of what you're trying to get financed. In my interactions with investors, climate investors, banks, multilateral development banks, I've always been amazed how risk-averse financiers are. The overestimation of that we think things are financeable is that the bar is very high to get reimbursable credit or loan financing for anything we do. And we have to realize that those who hold the purse strings, that investors and financiers, including those focusing on climate or on sustainable development, are presented with thousands of options what to finance. They can invest in a chocolate factory, they can invest in government bonds, they can invest in an electricity firm, or they can invest in your wash project. Why would they do so? They will compare, in the end, the financial returns and the risk profile of your project vis-a-vis all these other options. As a sector, we, the WASH family, also need to get better at articulating a strong climate rationale for water and sanitation. I've seen quite a lot of climate finance go to other sectors, such as solid waste management, landfills, off-grid energy, solar panels, cook stoves, with sometimes relatively low greenhouse gas impacts, relatively low CO2 reductions. But proponents of these projects have a clear climate story, including data. They clearly distinguish between climate mitigation, and that's where most climate finance is, and climate adaptation. And they don't have just a narrative, they have data. Do we know how many tons of CO2 are saved by reducing leakage in an urban water supply system? Do we know how many tons of CO2 are saved by various wastewater sludge management technologies in general and specifically in the country, in the project you work on? So learn about finance and learn that language. My second consideration is to think more in terms of vertical unbundling of WASH services. Let me explain what I mean. Vertical unbundling is actually a term that comes from the energy sector. It actually means that when you look at the surface chain, at getting energy from solar, from fossil fuels to households, the management models of that chain are actually cut in pieces. And a power plant might have a different management and financial structure, might be a private provider, than, for instance, the power grid or the transmission line. In WASH services, we traditionally have thought of utilities as all service of doing the whole chain, doing water treatment, doing water transport, doing water service delivery to household, billing and collections, and then also doing the wastewater chain. So getting the sewage out of houses, bringing it to a wastewater treatment plant and treating it. It's an integrated value chain. My point is that I think if you want to attract more climate financing and more reimbursable or commercial financing, we need to think different about that chain and we need to unbundle it. A few years ago, when I worked at the World Bank Group, I actually talked to the head of WASH services in IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And I was very surprised that basically all their private financing over the past decade had gone to wastewater treatment. And I see similar patterns in non-grant and reimbursable climate finance. Desalination plants, the first part of the chain, have been able to attract climate adaptation finance. Wastewater sludge treatment plants have been able to attract climate mitigation as they reduce greenhouse gases. SNV, the organization I had now, we co-managed together with FMO and others the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, and we see the same pattern. The first WASH projects we are considering for DFCD financing include desalination and producers and installers of solar pumps. Again, these kind of unbundled projects. Similarly, in other work we do to attract private firms to manage and invest in fecal sludge management in Bangladesh, South Asia and Africa and East Asia and elsewhere, is another example of that kind of ring-fenced, unbundled project. In all these examples, it proves easier to secure reimbursable financing for infrastructure projects that are ring-fenced, both financially and physically. Payment for services normally come from one customer in these cases, such as a distribution utility. The payment stream can be guaranteed by a central government or by an international finance institution. And the infrastructure is in a very specific site. That's a much more attractive proposition for somebody who wants his money back, including a climate financier, compared to water grids or sewer grids. for which it's been close to impossible to attract climate finance or commercial finance. In these grid infrastructures, revenue flows are dispersed. You need to collect money from thousands of households. Tariff settings is very political. And also land-related issues of having your pipes in dense urban areas and land disputes are actually scare off investors. While I worked at the World Bank in India, my team was advised in a number of successful private financing schemes for wastewater treatment plants along the Ganges River. These deals were based on a combined revenue, on the one hand from selling the clean wastewater, and for the rest by a revenue stream guaranteed by the federal government, the Union Government of India, the Treasury. These revenue streams made the project sufficiently attractive to attract reimbursable financing. That's an example of what I just said. So you might think I work on rural sanitation, I work on basic access. Why is she talking about wastewater treatment plant and desalination plants? That's not what I'm working on. Why I'm talking about that, and that's my third point, is because public financing is fungible. And the idea that everything will be financed by private financing, by climate financing, is just not true. Climate financing is not such a big stream. So what our collective responsibility is to attract investors, including climate finance, for projects that interest them. You then can simultaneously use scarce public financing for basic access, for poor communities and for poor countries. The example I gave about India, the government of India attracted private financing for the wastewater treatment, and that enabled them to repurpose some of their public funds, their scarce public funds, to basic access through the Swachh Bharat mission. Similarly, if donors can actually help to attract finance and no longer use grant money for wastewater treatment, for desal, for middle income countries, that overseas development aid can actually go where we want it to go. It can go to rural sanitation, it can go to targeted subsidies for low income households, for vulnerable households, and it can go to grid infrastructure because it's so much more difficult. We need to convince governments and donors to increase grants to finance basic services. Let's not fall into the trap again that we did in the 1990s, that we said WASH is a sunset sector and everything will be now financed by private resources, financed by climate sources. No, it's additional, but not so big. Let me finish up, Arjen. My last point actually is that climate finance is not a game changer. And it shouldn't become a distraction. It's welcome, it's additional money, and we should be smart about it. But in the end, we need to continue to focus on addressing the underlying causes of lack of finance in WASH system. Climate financiers want the same thing as other financiers: strong utilities, cost recovery, stable policies and regulation, transparent finances, and accountability to customers. So climate finance does not fundamentally change what we should do in the WASH sector. And let's continue to focus on these important things. Finance will flow. Climate finance will flow if we make the WASH sector a well-performing sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maaike. A world of wisdom on that, with words like vertical unbundling and discussing issues related even to land disputes, if you're talking about climate change and making investments in the WASH sector attractive to the donors. There have been a couple of questions already coming up as we go along. We'll be coming back to that later. I would first like to welcome Marcel Bokelboom. He's the climate envoy for the Netherlands and has got a wealth of experience around working with multi-stakeholders and is able to look at a wider picture. He's been listening in, and we would welcome some of his thoughts to this as well. Marcel, I believe you're online, and I hope you can.
Yes, I am.
Thank you very much. Over to you.
You do hear me, you do see me.
Yes.
First of all, very good to see that so many people from all over the world called in, and I think this is one of the good things of our lockdown, is that we have been able to interact much more intimately and much more frequently with each other across the globe than we were used to. At least that's my experience. So that is a good thing, and I think the debate that we're having now, and as you introduced it in the beginning, is a testimony to that. Normally, the colleagues from Kenya, Ethiopia, the United States, Denmark, and I saw many other countries wouldn't be able to join in, and now they are. So that, I think, adds value to it, and it brings different voices and different perspectives. You opened up the debate by referring to the title of the debate with the question mark: is it a distraction or a necessity? Having listened to the three speakers, I think that question is easily answered. You chose presenters that actually all lead us to this is a necessity. So the title WASH debate is not really appropriate. We're not having a debate here. Actually, we move one stage beyond and we get into the how. And I think Meike's presentation was very illustrative for that, with many examples of actually how we should look differently and how we have to become smarter. And she also used the term "we" a lot, and that is an interesting one. And that was the second part of your getting to know each other questions in the beginning. Yes, we do come from all over the world, but many of the participants in this seminar are active in what you have called the WASH sector, and in that I think lies a little bit of a danger as well. Working in a sector sometimes can lead to working in a silo, and that is something that I've experienced in the world that I operate in, and that you could call the climate sector. If you think of the negotiators and the climate professionals that do gather annually at a COP, you could think of a sector as well. But at the same time, climate in itself is nothing. You cannot pick it up. And I think especially Majuri and Lemessa illustrated that you have to connect it to practical examples, to real life, to the level of countries and regions and households even, to see what climate change actually means in practice. Let me go over a few things that I picked up of the presentations, with this being the start. Be wary of siloism. This is definitely something that everybody should take into account, but I think in the WASH sector that is something to be aware of. I like Majuri's very individual example, but that is definitely useful for the higher and more abstract level. But one thing that I take from her presentation is the perspective that she chooses, and that is the perspective of a health professional. And that is an interesting one, because we can make a connection there. Like I said in the beginning, climate change in itself is nothing. It's you have to connect it to other topics. Health is definitely an angle, and it's an angle that is gaining traction also in the world of climate negotiators. At the last COP in Madrid, the WHO, and that was, mind you, before COVID-19 was even a term, health professionals and the WHO were there, as they were in New York at the Climate Action Summit in September last year, also bringing this global long-term abstract crisis that climate change is to today and to the short term, and also to the individual level of people. And that is, I think, something to also to take into account. And with that, bringing it to the local level, and also with the examples that we got from Ethiopia and India, we, and I say this with a Western perspective, also get the inequality that is underlying our global society in our face. And climate change, in a way, and that is the example that Marjorie gave, is an equalizer. It strikes irrespective of how rich you are, on what part of the globe you are. It's just hitting you wherever you are. And she had the examples of the cyclones. But then when it comes to the reaction to it, or being resilient and adapting to climate change, it indeed does matter where you live and how developed you are. And there again, we do see the inequality again. So I would like to pick that one out. Inequality is something to be addressed, whether it is at a country level, developed versus developing, rich versus poor, the one region compared to the other. But also, and I think that is an important point to pick up from Marjorie's presentation as well, the fact that women are disproportionately hit. So there is an inequality between men and women as well. And we need to take that into account when we try to think of solutions. Finally, on Marjorie's presentation, I take the examples of the challenges that she sees, but also that there are opportunities in the current crisis of the COVID-19 crisis. And interestingly, again, there's the perspective of the health professional again. Washing hands has become much more common and accepted, something that hygiene professionals have been fighting for long. And all of a sudden there was this crisis, and it was actually leaders, presidents, at least many of them, advocating for washing hands. That is interesting, and it's definitely something that we should keep from this. Then over to Lemessa and the vulnerability of Ethiopia. Also, Lemessa answered the question, is this a necessity or a luxury, with a clear answer, yes. This is a necessity to take adaptation into account. But interestingly enough, and I would like to ask everybody to copy the last slide of his presentation, see that there are actually also some distractions in here. And that is a little segue to Meike's presentation later, but I think also to the roles of all of us on this call and all of us active in this field. One thing that I take from Lemessa's presentation as well is the role of government. He illustrated several initiatives in Ethiopia with the strategies that were put in place by the Ethiopian government. And I think that is important to realize. The role of government is important as a planner, as a leader sometimes, and sometimes as a financier. I'll get back to that one later as well. But at least to be involved from the early stages, as the Global Commission on Adaptation calculated last year. Early action is also the most cost-efficient action. If we do act now, it might be up to 7 times cheaper than if we wait for another 1 or 2 decades. So that is something that should interest all politicians and all policymakers, but basically everybody active in this field. Also, and that is the importance of design that Lemessa put his finger on. If you do act early, you act in the planning stage, and the solutions that you come up with have to be designed with climate change and climate adaptation and resilience being part of that. And that is often forgotten. When we also looking at developing countries, we do see that adaptation comes after disaster has struck. And we seem to be very stubborn in learning those lessons. And I'm actually very happy to hear from Lemessa that in Ethiopia this is taken into account from a very early stage. And that is what Lemessa said in answer to one of the questions, use indigenous knowledge. That is something that we should take into account wherever we are in the world. Indigenous knowledge is not something that is reserved for countries where we use the term indigenous people. No, this is something that is knowledge that comes from the bottom up and from practice, and that is something that WASH professionals can definitely bring to the table. Then finally to Meike's presentation. Meike was talking about financing. I do hear someone switching his microphone on. That might be a distraction for several of us. When we think of financing, and it's interesting, Maaike illustrates where she sits in the NGO world, like many of you, and financing is often brought back to the funds that governments bring in, that private donors bring in, that multilateral development banks bring in. And Maaike even used the term public grants as a very important source of financing. That's absolutely true. But she also said the 100 billion that we are talking about in climate change circles is definitely not enough. If we're honest, it's just the tip that you give to a waiter after he or she has served you well. The real important article in the Paris Agreement is Article 2.1c. And Article 2.1c tells us that we have to try to bring all financial flows in the world in line with the two main objectives of the Paris Agreement. And those are mitigation and adaptation. Yes, on par, those two. And that means that we have to mainstream that, to use that term that has been used by several of the speakers, to use climate change to apply a lens and a perspective that actually is, and I'm getting back to the term design, that in the early stages, whether it is an investment, it's a government plan, we have to apply that lens. We have to adapt that way of thinking through everything we do. And we, in developing businesses, in the wash sector, in climate change, we are slowly getting used to that. We have learned that trick, and we do accept our role in that. But the majority of people that is active in other sectors and is actually controlling private finance still has to learn that trick, still has to learn to apply that lens and that perspective. And they need help with that. It's not a lack of will. It's often the fact that they still are at the beginning of that learning curve. And that also means, and I'd really like Maaike using the term language. Language is critical here. And that is not only the language that in the NGO world has often been the most important language, protesting, trying to convince others that they have to work differently. No, it's actually also a way of teaching others to think with you towards a common purpose. And if you ask me, also active as a member of the Dutch platform for sustainable finance, I observe that we're making progress. The fact that green recovery has made it into the lingo of policymakers, heads of state, but also the leaders of the IMF and the World Bank is a good one. So I'm actually positive that we get there, but time is short. And of the decisions that are being taken now for the bailout packages and all the investments that will come to get to invest in the crisis, only 4% today as we speak, and that is a Bloomberg figure of last week, can be labeled as green. So there is a lot of work to do. Finally, and I think I'm over my time already. I hear Arjen, I hear you. Focusing on the current context, the context of COVID-19, there are opportunities here. I spoke about the perspective and the zoom lens that we have to apply, bring others on board and teach them how to do that. Large quantities of finance will come available in the short term. Do try to get a portion of that, but also do help others to invest it wisely. And many people actually, by sitting at home and having time at their hands, but also economies coming to a standstill, do get a clear picture of what are the wrongs of the old system. So the analysis is being made. Now the right choices have to be made. Then the threats of this current situation, short-termism, quickly investing in bailouts of the old economy, locking ourselves in the 3.7 economy. Again, what I mentioned earlier, siloism, a real threat. We have to get out of that and make connections to others. And again, what I started with, inequality. Inequality is always there, and we have to address the sources and the underlying patterns of that inequality. And we need each other for that, to keep on telling those stories, as Majuri and Lemessa have done, but as many others on this call can do. So there I stop, Arjen, and thank all speakers, and also thanks to the organizers for their important contributions.
Thank you very much. There's been a lot of reflection there, and a couple of things I really picked up from it. And one of them was related to the need for storytelling, which was mentioned by Meike, but also, of course, from Majuri as a keen storyteller. I'm going to request a couple of people, Digby Joy, Simona Klawitter, and after that, Kate Harawa, to explain a little bit what they've put in the chat. Let's see if you are able to connect and speak. Can we try and start with Digby Joy? Are you able to connect and speak and talk a bit about stories? Over to you, Digby.
Hi, Arjen. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, I was trying to understand from the lectures, and also try to find a couple of things from the chat box. And one statistics came that only a handful of the donors has actually responded to hygiene to fight against COVID-19, and that clearly expresses us that sometimes we are not being able to show that how appealing the issue of hygiene is to fight against COVID-19. And here comes the question of language, how we are communicating with the others, whether we are understanding the language to convince the policymakers, number one, or whether we are being able to convince the people. And that's where, Meike has already explained that sometimes we have to understand the language of finance, and sometimes we have to make things very simple to the common people, to make them aware about the need. And in shorter term, I would say the experience of what we are experiencing for COVID-19, but in broader sense, making people aware about the reality through storytelling would also help us to generate more resource for fighting against climate change also. So this is what I think.
It's a very nice contribution. It's also making the link with COVID and climate change, that messaging is very important, but also to whom you message, and particularly getting also local people on board, like Majuri has been able to do with her women's group, to be able to relate to the issues and strengthen their own approaches. Right. Simona Klawitter, can I ask you to explain a little bit of the financing remarks you've been making in the chat? Are you able to speak?
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, thank you.
So that's the advantage of sitting in Germany. Let me just comment on that. Schools are open again, and the only thing which is not working yet is the soccer games, which I'm not really missing, but so that's the last thing which is opening in Germany. Coming back to your question, I totally agree to what Meike has said, that we have to swing along with the needs and the thinking and the understanding of those financing private capital. And this means that we also have to kind of favor what they like to favor, to put money in. At the other hand, so this will free money, as Meike also said, money from the taxpayers, which we might then spend focusing on those in need, leaving no one behind. But this needs to be linked. And here we are, again, while I kind of like the idea of vertical unbundling, we are again in the position that we have to link all activities, so the whole sector together. So we need the systems approach, which we are all now talking about. And I think we are getting a much better understanding what this means. For financing, we are talking blended financing, and there are many, many options to do this, and this needs a localized approach. So while I do think there are many ways to please our donors, we also need to be much more in the forefront in this discussion on what kind of alternative financing mechanisms where we link all these different levels of the sector development together. How do we develop such innovative blended or innovative financing mechanisms to close the gap, which is beyond the taxpayers' money and the private capital? So there needs to be much more out, and we need to showcase that the WASH sector is able to do this. I personally also think that we need a much louder campaign to be heard in the world of what kind of financing is needed for the WASH sector. I find it incredibly irritating that everybody is asked to wash hands, but the funding, it was in a comment earlier which I made today, but the funding doesn't go to the WASH sector these days. Yeah, I find it irritating. So there is a mistake we are doing in communication. So it's not only about the facts, it's also how we talk, and we are back to the language question here.
And that links nicely to the remark that Kate Harawa also made. How can we make the case for tangible outputs? Kate, would you like to say something about that? Are you able to connect and speak? Because I think one of the things that keeps coming up is we have to be able to tell the story, and we shouldn't only make that story up for donors because we might get funding, but also because we really believe that it's something that leads to change and improvement, making the WASH systems more resilient, increasing or decreasing the carbon emission or the methane emission in a case of sanitation. One of the things that I found very interesting is that those that have succeeded, according to Meike, are the ones that are more sanitation related. Whereas when you look at most of the resources available, adaptation is always around water. It's always about water is what carbon is for mitigation, water is for adaptation. It's the combining thing of everything. But we are not yet able to tell the compelling story in such a way that it makes sense for the utility manager down on the ground and to a financer that may be interested to finance part of it. Kate, I think I can hear you now. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. I was muted. Yes, I was looking at the presentation on financing and the language that she was using in terms of climate financing. And I think it's generally hard to convince investors, to convince financials in terms of to finance something that they are not able to see the tangible results, because they want to see results immediately. But I think as we design our communication, we should be able to show the benefits beyond that, whatever we may be doing in the process. So as you highlighted issues of wastewater treatment, or if they are financing something that is going to help reduce soil erosion, they should look at the benefits in terms of the resources that will be saved in water quality reagents or something that would help to clean the water. So we really need to find language that would attract them, although we may know that our target is something else, but package it in a way that they are able to see results immediately. Otherwise, it's hard to convince or to attract donors or financials.
Yeah, it's this big difficulty. Who are we making the story for? Is it for the donors, or is it because it's what we find on the ground and it's because we feel we need to act and adapt? And that always remains one of the challenges to it. I would just like to ask, is there any of the presenters who would still like to say something before we go towards the wrapping up? Majuri, Lemessa, or Meike, would you want to say something still? Please, Majuri.
Yeah, thank you for the different perspectives. Definitely the finance perspective that I got from my kid was really important, and about the different kind of stories. As someone who loves telling stories to people, and as a communicator myself, I really agree with that. And I also feel that education about climate action or climate change in the wash sector is also important, and how climate. I think a lot of people who are currently working in the wash sector, not just only on the chat today, but also out there in India, a lot of us don't know how climate action or what the climate crisis is about. So I think there is scope for also educating ourselves about it so that we can talk about it more and how we can link it in our work. So I really find a lot of resources online from climate reality after getting myself trained as a climate reality leader. So after that, I could connect the dots more. So I feel that is really important, that education and how we communicate about it after what we learn.
Thank you very much. Lemessa, would you like to reflect a little bit of what you've been hearing?
Yes, thank you, Arya. Just only one point. Having or addressing wash issues in any community or citizen means having like a resilient community for every shock. So I think just we have to see wash from that aspect, because it is not only climate change, but for any emergency response, wash is still really the main element to make people's very resilient to any aspect.
It's one of the bases of also the COVID response and the whole awareness campaigns around that. Before we go to the finalizing of the quiz and the final remarks, Meike, you've been seeing also some comments coming up in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks very much for some very interesting comments. I'm not going to address all of them. I want to say three things in wrapping up from my side. First of all, we need to, somebody said, we need to mainstream climate finance in all our financing. That's true. But we also need to step up the volume of financing coming into the country, into the sector. And I think there, yes, we can say all financiers, all financiers, all investors, all financial sources need to be climate sensitive. But the question, that should not become an excuse for the public sector to invest in poverty alleviation and basic wash services. I really would like to keep repeating that, because sometimes you say, yeah, everybody needs to act, the private sector needs to act, private investors need to act, but what does that mean for the role of the public sector? And that's not only donors, it's also very much government in the countries where we talk about wash. Second, a question from unbundling and systems interventions. I think unbundling is not a contradiction with system thinking, and I'm very much a system thinker. You need to think about policy, about financing, about customers, about the whole chain. In the 1980s, there was a slogan on environment: think globally and act locally. I think that's what it is. You think in systems, but in the end, you then need to take this apart and think about project financing, about individual interventions, always against that system background. And that brings me to my third point. All solutions are local, all solutions are specific. Let's not underestimate the handiwork, the craft of putting together financing schemes and the need to mix and match different financing resources. There's a lot of work in there. We have on this call a great amount of WASH professionals. Don't think of WASH systems only as WASH sector professionals. You need to get out of your silos, as some people say. Make friends with people who understand financing. That's my last remark. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And the de-siloing and making friends, unfortunately, we don't have the ability of networking like we normally do within the WASH debates, but we do connect, of course, in many different ways. So I'm going to we're going to finalize the quiz, see if there is going to be a winner. I noticed that I think Ingeborg had a lot of points and she left, so that will give a chance to somebody else. And then some closing remarks, which will take about 2 more minutes. Could you link up Mentimeter one more time, Evita? because people do want to have the price, or at least want to know what the price is. So the reason to do a little bit of this was to see who has been paying attention to the discussion. And first of all, one quick word, how would you, okay, go for the feeling. Can you answer, how are you feeling? Just a quick evaluation. Go on the Mentimeter. Oh, wow, smarter, I like that one. Inspired, cool, people still have a lot of energy, lots of positive words. And the hot, well, climate change might be partly. Okay, please go to the quiz, slightly depressed. I hope that's not too more the situation or the challenge that's ahead than the energy you might have. And the prize is going to be, well, now I'll tell it towards the end. Let's go to the questions that were there. Okay, there was spoken of a NAP. What does it stand for? Does it stand for a no adaptation process, national action program, national adaptations plan, or New Amsterdam spell? And you've got a couple of seconds more to answer. And everybody went for a national adaptation plan, though New Amsterdam spell would have been correct because the Dutch people will know it's the water level, and that is being the measuring of all the climate change and sea level rise is done against the NAP. Okay, over to the next one. How often was water mentioned in the Paris Declaration? We've got water as a word. How often was it in the big Paris Declaration of 2015? It's one of the big ways of adaptation. And 9 people are correct. It wasn't mentioned in the actual document. It tells a lot of stories, a lot about carbon talk about it. But basically, the water sector since that time has been fighting for its space and recognition within the global climate change discussion that water is essential, in particular for adaptation. We as a sector, as WASH, have an even stronger role to play into that, to make sure that we are heard within the water debate and within the climate change. And it shows that policies and practices around that are very important. So let's go to the leadership board. I could see something already popping up, and the winner should be showing up. And I have somebody called Cool. Is that the winner? No, we've been pulling up. And Kelly. Kelly, you are the winner with 2,733 points, basically for paying attention. So the prize is going to be one wonderful red water bottle will be sent to you as a reminder of the story, how climate change can affect everybody and can come to your house. So thank you very much for that. And congratulations, we will find a way to send it to you. In summary, I would like to close with some remarks. We've been hearing about leadership, both at the individual level, but also at the political level and around hand washing. We've been hearing a lot about finance, that it's difficult to attract, and even then it's still only a small part of the funding that we would be needing. And a whole component about languages, the stories that we want to tell and how we want to show it. So maybe sometimes we should send out an SOS, advocate stronger for it. And then Michael was already reflecting on it as well, the unbundling versus system approach. How do we balance those two, either from a donor perspective or for storytelling or for getting clear where the additionality is? And that's from a personal story, from the red bottle through to other components as well at utilities, regional, or even international and national level. My final words are there's going to be an evaluation on Mentimeter that will be started straight after this. Please do add your thoughts on it, how to improve it. Thank you all for your attendance. We will be having a new WASH debate towards October, November. And one final question to Phil. Can you go back to the other one? Sorry, where are we on the, I did really like to see that one. Please fill that one. Looking at the delivery of WASH service in low and middle income context, where would you place yourself? That's my last question before the evaluation. And we're going very much towards the necessity. The idea was that this would be showing up a little bit more often, but as one can see, just like in a workshop space, it's always a bit of working around. We're on the 8.2 towards necessity, so there's still a little bit of thoughts on the other side as well. Thank you very much. Please follow Mentimeter for the final evaluation, and thank you all for your attention and for your contributions.